My mama always said that if I ever felt lost, I should remember one name. The little girl's voice was soft, almost swallowed by the music drifting through the grand ballroom, but the effect was immediate. A crystal glass slipped from Charles Whitmore's hand and shattered against the polished marble floor. Conversations died. Laughter vanished. Hundreds of guests turned toward the sound. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They simply stared at the billionaire whose face had suddenly gone pale beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. Charles Whitmore was not a man who lost control. At 52 years old, he had built one of the largest real estate empires in America. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Business networks called him unstoppable. Employees described him as disciplined, brilliant, and impossible to surprise. Yet now he stood frozen in the middle of his own charity gala, staring at a little black girl standing alone beneath the stage lights. She could not have been older than 8. Her dark curls were gathered into neat braids tied with blue ribbons. Her dress was simple, slightly worn around the sleeves, but carefully pressed. A silver bracelet rested loosely around her wrist. She held a microphone with both hands, as if she were afraid it might float away. The giant screen behind her displayed her name, Nia Brooks, winner of the Whitmore Foundation Young Voices essay competition. A few seconds earlier, the audience had been smiling. Nia had just finished reading an essay about hope, family, and courage that had moved several guests to tears. The applause had lasted nearly a minute. Then the host had asked a simple question. Nia, who inspired you to write something so beautiful? The little girl smiled. My mama. More applause followed. Then came the next question. And what's your mother's name? Nia answered without hesitation. Grace Brooks. The moment those two words left her lips, Charles Whitmore stopped breathing. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller. The air felt thinner. Somewhere in the distance, someone called his name, but the sound barely reached him. Grace Brooks. The name echoed through his mind like a voice. Traveling across decades, 23 years disappeared in an instant. He could almost smell the ocean breeze from Charleston. He could almost hear laughter carried across a summer evening. He could almost see a young woman standing beneath a street lamp, smiling as rain dripped from her dark hair. Grace. His Grace. The woman he had spent half his life trying to forget. The woman he had loved before wealth, before skyscrapers, before private jets and boardrooms. The woman who had vanished from his life without explanation. The woman whose absence had become a wound he never allowed anyone to see. Charles blinked. The memory disappeared, but the ache remained. Across the room, Nia continued smiling, unaware that the entire evening had just changed. Sir, one of his executives whispered beside him. Are you okay? Charles didn't answer. His eyes never left the stage. Nia shifted nervously under the attention. She looked smaller now beneath the towering lights and giant projection screens. Yet there was something familiar about her. Something impossible to explain. The shape of her eyes. The tilt of her head. The quiet confidence hidden beneath her nervousness. It stirred something deep inside him. The host laughed softly, trying to ease the tension spreading through the room. Well, it seems Miss Brooks has left quite an impression tonight. A few guests chuckled politely. The mood attempted to recover. But Charles could not move. Then Nia spoke again. My mama used to tell me stories about someone who helped her believe in better days. Charles felt his heart stumble. She said he always told her not to give up after the rain. This time the room truly disappeared. Charles heard nothing else. Not the music. Not the whispers. Not the cameras. Only those words. After the rain. Nobody else should have known that phrase. Nobody. It had belonged to a private memory. A promise exchanged long ago between two young dreamers sitting on an old wooden pier while a thunderstorm rolled away into the Atlantic. After the rain, things get better. He had said those words hundreds of times. To Grace. Only Grace. Charles slowly stepped forward. Guests parted instinctively. A path opened through the ballroom. Every eye followed him. Nobody understood what was happening. They only knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Nia noticed him approaching and lowered the microphone slightly. Her eyes widened. Even she recognized Charles Whitmore. Everyone in America knew who he was. Yet there was no fear in her expression. Only curiosity. Charles stopped at the edge of the stage. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched across the enormous room. Then Charles finally found his voice. It came out barely above a whisper. What did you say your mother's name was? Nia smiled politely. Grace Brooks, sir. Tears instantly filled Charles Whitmore's eyes. A collective gasp swept through the audience. The billionaire quickly looked away, but it was too late. Everyone saw it. The most powerful man in the room was fighting back tears because of a little girl and a name from the past. Nia's smile faded. She could see the sadness in his face now. The kind of sadness children somehow recognize better than adults. She hesitated before speaking again. Did you know her? Charles opened his mouth, but no answer came. Because the truth was far more complicated than that. He had known Grace Brooks once. He had loved her once. And standing beneath the ballroom lights, looking into the eyes of an 8-year-old girl wearing a silver bracelet that suddenly seemed strangely familiar, Charles Whitmore realized that the past he thought had disappeared forever might be standing right in front of him. The silence inside the ballroom seemed to stretch forever. Charles Whitmore stood at the edge of the stage, his chest rising slowly as he struggled to steady himself. Across from him, Nia Brooks held the microphone with both hands, her small fingers tightening around it as she watched the billionaire wipe at the corner of his eye. The audience remained completely still. Nobody understood what had happened, but everyone could feel it. The air itself seemed heavier. The host glanced nervously between them before offering an uncertain smile. Perhaps we should continue with the program. The words barely landed. Charles raised a hand without looking away from Nia. The gesture was polite, but firm. The host immediately fell silent. Charles swallowed hard. How old are you, Nia? He asked. 8, sir. Her voice was calm. And your mother? Where is she now? For the first time, a shadow crossed her expression. She lowered her eyes briefly before looking back up. My mama passed away last year. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Charles felt something twist deep inside his chest. For a moment, he could not speak. He had spent more than 2 decades wondering what had become of Grace. He had imagined hundreds of possibilities. He had never imagined this. Nia shifted her weight slightly. Are you okay, sir? The question was so simple that several guests exchanged surprised looks. She was standing in front of one of the richest men in America, yet she sounded more concerned about him than herself. Charles let out a quiet breath. I am not sure. A few people smiled sadly. Nia nodded as though she understood. Sometimes I say that too. The answer caught him off guard. A faint laugh escaped him despite the ache in his chest. It was the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from Charles Whitmore all evening. Your mother used to say something very similar, he admitted. Nia blinked. You knew her? The question hung between them. Charles looked away toward the enormous windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Thousands of city lights glittered against the darkness beyond the glass. A long time ago, he said quietly. A very long time ago. Nia seemed to study his face. Children often notice things adults ignored. She noticed the sadness behind his smile. She noticed the way his eyes kept drifting toward her bracelet. And she noticed that every time he looked at her, it felt as though he was trying to remember something. Mama talked about someone once, she said. The room grew still again. Charles slowly returned his gaze to her. What did she say? Nia hesitated. Not much. She looked down at the silver bracelet hanging loosely from her wrist. She said there was someone who always believed tomorrow could be better than today. Charles felt his pulse quicken. Did she tell you his name? Nia shook her head. No, she never did. A strange mixture of relief and disappointment washed through him. Before he could respond, a woman stepped forward from the front row. Margaret Whitmore. Elegant as always, dressed in a tailored navy gown, her expression carefully composed. Charles, she said gently, the guests are concerned. Perhaps this conversation would be better held in private. Her voice sounded reasonable, calm, polished, yet something about it immediately made Charles tense. Nia glanced toward Margaret, then back to Charles. I did not mean to upset anyone. You did not, Charles said quickly. You have done nothing wrong. Margaret offered a practiced smile toward the audience. Of course she has not. But Nia noticed that the smile never quite reached her eyes. Charles noticed it too. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Nia carefully removed the microphone from its stand. My mama gave me something before she got sick. Charles stared at her. What was it? Instead of answering, Nia slowly raised her wrist. The silver bracelet caught the light from the chandeliers above. Tiny reflections danced across the stage. Charles felt the color drain from his face. The engraving. Even from several feet away, he recognized it. His heart seemed to stop. The bracelet was old now, worn smooth by years of use. But there was no mistake. He knew every curve, every detail, because he had chosen it himself. 23 years earlier. Nia looked down at it and smiled softly. She told me never to lose it. Charles took a slow step forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. May I see it? The little girl hesitated for only a second before nodding. As she carefully slipped the bracelet from her wrist and extended it toward him, Charles Whitmore realized that whatever answers he had spent a lifetime searching for might finally be within reach. The ballroom remained silent as Nia placed the bracelet into Charles Whitmore's trembling hand. The silver felt unexpectedly warm despite its age. For a moment, he simply stared at it. The engraving along the inside edge was faded, but still visible beneath the crystal lights. After the rain, his throat tightened. He remembered, standing inside a tiny jewelry shop in Charleston more than 2 decades earlier. He had been young then, carrying more dreams than money. Grace had laughed when he gave it to her, because the bracelet cost only a few dollars. She had called it the most valuable gift she had ever received. Charles slowly traced the engraving with his thumb. Around him, hundreds of guests watched in complete silence. Nobody understood the significance of the worn piece of silver, but everyone could see the emotion written across his face. Nia stood patiently. She did not rush him. She did not demand answers. She simply waited. Finally, Charles looked up. His eyes were shining. Where did your mother get this? Nia smiled softly. She said someone special gave it to her a long time ago. Charles closed his eyes briefly. The answer struck deeper than he expected. Someone special. Grace had kept it all these years. Through every season. Through every hardship. Through every unanswered question. She had kept it. Margaret stepped forward again, her expression calm, but noticeably tighter than before. Charles, she said quietly, perhaps this is not the place. Charles did not look at her. His attention remained fixed on the bracelet. How long have you had this, Nia? As long as I can remember. She folded her hands together. Mama never took it off until she got sick. Then she gave it to me. The little girl hesitated before adding. She told me that one day I would understand why it mattered. A strange feeling settled over Charles. It was not certainty. It was not even hope. It was something far more dangerous. Possibility. For years he had convinced himself that the chapter involving Grace Brooks had ended forever. Yet every word Nia spoke seemed to unlock another forgotten door. Did your mother ever talk about Charleston? He asked carefully. Nia's eyes widened. Yes. Charles felt his pulse quicken. What did she say? She said it was where she learned that some people can change your life even if they do not stay in it. Several guests exchanged emotional glances. Charles looked away toward the city skyline beyond the ballroom windows. The lights of Manhattan blurred slightly, through the moisture gathering in his eyes. That sounded exactly like Grace. Even after all these years, it sounded exactly like her. Nia shifted closer to the edge of the stage. Did you know my mama well? Charles opened his mouth, then stopped. The honest answer was complicated. He had known her better than anyone once. Better than business partners. Better than family. Better than himself sometimes. Yet somehow he had lost her completely. I knew her when we were young, he said at last. Nia smiled. Mama always liked stories about when people were young. A faint laugh escaped Charles. So did Grace. The words slipped out naturally. For the first time all evening, Nia's expression changed. She noticed he had said Grace instead of your mother. Not Mrs. Brooks. Not your mom. Grace. As if he had known her personally. As if the memory still lived inside him. You miss her, do not you? Nia asked. The question landed with surprising gentleness. Charles stared at her. No reporter had ever asked him something so direct. No executive would have dared. Yet somehow this little girl did not sound intrusive. She sounded compassionate. The room seemed to hold its breath. Charles looked down at the bracelet again. Every day, he whispered. Nia's eyes softened. I miss her too. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Across the ballroom, even the waitstaff had stopped moving. The moment felt fragile, like something precious suspended in time. Then Nia reached into the pocket of her dress. There is something else. Charles looked up immediately. Something else. She nodded. Slowly, she removed a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from years of careful handling. The paper looked old. Very old. Nia held it gently with both hands. Mama told me to keep this safe. Charles felt a chill run through him. What is it? Nia glanced down at the folded paper before looking back at him. She said if I ever met the man who gave her the bracelet, I should give him this. A stunned silence swept through the ballroom. Charles could hear his own heartbeat. Margaret's face lost color. For the first time that evening, genuine alarm flickered across her carefully controlled expression. Nia stepped forward and extended the folded paper toward Charles. He stared at it, as though it were a message traveling through time itself. Whatever waited inside those pages had been written years ago by the woman he had never stopped thinking about. And as his trembling hand reached toward the letter, Charles Whitmore realized that the answers he had spent 23 years searching for might finally be waiting on the other side of a single unfolded page. Charles stared at the folded letter resting in his hand. The paper felt impossibly light, yet heavier than anything he had carried in years. Around him, the ballroom remained silent. The orchestra had stopped. The guests had forgotten their conversations. Even the city beyond the towering windows seemed distant now. Nia stood quietly before him, watching with patient eyes. She did not appear nervous. She looked like a child fulfilling a promise she had carried for a very long time. Charles carefully unfolded the paper. The edges were worn from age. The handwriting across the page was unmistakable. Grace. His breath caught instantly. For a moment, he could not read. Simply seeing her handwriting was enough to pull him backward through decades of memories. Then his eyes found the first line. Charles, if you are reading this, then life has finally done what I could never seem to do myself. It has brought our paths together again. His hands trembled. He continued reading. I do not know how many years have passed. I do not know who you have become, but I know who you were. You were the young man who believed every storm would end. You were the man who taught me not to give up when the future looked impossible. A painful warmth spread through his chest. The ballroom disappeared entirely. There was only Grace's voice inside his mind. I waited for your letters. I waited longer than I should have. Eventually, I believed you had forgotten me. I told myself that moving forward was the brave thing to do. Some days I succeeded. Some days I did not. Charles lowered the page. His face had gone pale. Forgotten her? Never. Not for a single day. He looked toward Margaret instinctively. His older sister stood. Perfectly still. Too still. Charles returned his attention to the letter. There is something I never wanted you to learn from anyone else. If life ever gives you the chance to meet the little girl carrying this letter, please know she was the greatest blessing I ever received. Nia glanced down at her shoes as Charles continued reading. A soft smile appeared on his face despite the tears gathering in his eyes. Grace's words felt alive. Honest. Gentle. Exactly as he remembered. The next line changed everything. I told her stories about kindness. I told her stories about courage. And sometimes, when she needed hope, I told her stories about a young man named Charles. A gasp escaped several guests nearby. Charles closed his eyes. For 23 years, he had believed he had vanished from Grace's life completely. Yet somehow she had kept his memory alive. He looked up at Nia. The little girl smiled shyly. She used to tell me those stories before bed, she said softly. Charles could barely speak. She did. Nia nodded. She said you always helped people even when nobody was watching. The compliment felt undeserved. Not because it was unkind, but because he had failed in the one place that mattered most. He returned to the letter. The final section was shorter. The handwriting appeared slightly weaker. If you are reading this, it means Nia found you. That alone tells me she was brave enough to keep going. Please be kind to her. She has a habit of carrying too much responsibility for someone so young. Remind her that she does not have to earn love. Remind her that she matters exactly as she is. Charles swallowed hard. The final sentence sat alone at the bottom of the page. And if you ever wonder whether I stopped caring, the answer is no. Not once. Not ever. The ballroom remained silent as Charles slowly lowered the letter. His eyes were wet now. He did not try to hide it. Nia watched him carefully. Mama always cried a little when she talked about you, she admitted. Charles looked at her. She did. Only sometimes. Nia smiled. Usually after she thought I was asleep. Something inside him broke quietly. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough for years of unanswered questions to begin falling away. Then a new question took their place. If Grace had waited for his letters, why had she never answered his? Why had every message he sent come back unanswered? Why had 23 years disappeared between them? Charles slowly turned toward Margaret. His sister's expression remained composed, but her eyes betrayed something else. Worry. Real worry. For the first time that evening, Charles noticed it clearly. Margaret, he said quietly, His voice was calm, but firm. "We need to talk." Margaret forced a small smile. "This is hardly the time." "I think it is exactly the time." The room seemed to tighten around them. Nia looked between the two adults, sensing something she could not fully understand. Charles folded Grace's letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket near his heart. Then he looked back at Nia. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" The little girl blinked. "Just dinner?" A few guests smiled. Charles laughed softly through his tears. "Yes, just dinner." Nia considered the offer for a moment before nodding. "Okay." For the first time all evening, genuine warmth returned to Charles Whitmore's face. Yet even as he smiled, his thoughts remained fixed on Margaret and the fear he had seen in her eyes. Because deep inside, he was beginning to suspect that the story he had believed for 23 years might not have been the truth at all. The gala ended earlier than anyone expected. Guests lingered in small groups, whispering about what they had witnessed, but Charles Whitmore paid little attention to any of it. For the first time in years, a board meeting, a business acquisition, or a headline felt completely insignificant. An hour later, he and Nia sat across from each other in a quiet private dining room overlooking the Hudson River. The city lights shimmered across the dark water like scattered stars. A small dinner rested untouched between them. Charles had ordered several dishes, but neither seemed particularly interested in food. Nia sat with careful posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The silver bracelet was back on her wrist. Every few moments Charles found himself looking at it. Again. "Mama always said New York looked prettier at night," Nia said softly. Charles followed her gaze toward the window. She was right. Nia smiled. She usually was. The answer made him smile too. There was something familiar about the way she spoke. Not just her words. Her rhythm. Her warmth. Her quiet confidence. The resemblance to Grace seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. A server entered briefly to refill their water glasses before quietly leaving them alone again. When the door closed, the room returned to silence. Nia glanced toward him. "Can I ask something?" "Anything." "Why did you look so sad when you heard Mama's name?" Charles leaned back slowly. It was a simple question, but the answer carried decades behind it. "Because I spent a very long time wondering what happened to her." Nia lowered her eyes. She wondered too. The words landed gently, but they struck with surprising force. Charles stared at the table. "Did she ever talk about why we stopped seeing each other?" Nia shook her head. "Not really." She paused. "Whenever I asked, she would smile and say that some stories needed time before they made sense." Charles exhaled slowly. That sounded exactly like Grace. She had always believed patience revealed things that force never could. Nia reached into her small purse and carefully removed a faded photograph. "I brought this." Charles accepted it carefully. His breath caught immediately. The picture showed Grace sitting on a park bench holding a much younger Nia. The image was old, slightly faded around the edges, but Grace's smile was unmistakable. Charles stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then he noticed something else. Grace was wearing the bracelet. The same bracelet. The same engraving. The same memory he thought had disappeared forever. "This was taken when I was 4, Nia explained. "Mama kept it in a box with letters and old papers." Charles looked up sharply. "Letters?" Nia nodded. "A lot of letters." His pulse quickened. "Letters from who?" "I do not know." She shrugged. "Most of them had your name on the envelopes." The room suddenly felt smaller. Charles sat completely still. For years he had believed. Grace ignored every letter he sent, every birthday card, every attempt to reconnect. Yet now another possibility was beginning to emerge. "Did you bring any of them?" he asked carefully. Nia shook her head. "No. They are at home." Charles nodded, trying to hide the storm building inside him. Home. Somewhere there might be answers. Somewhere there might be proof that the past had not unfolded the way he believed. Nia studied his face. "You are thinking really hard." Charles laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." For the first time all evening, the tension eased between them. They shared a small smile. Then Nia reached into her purse again. This time she pulled out a tiny folded note. "Mama wrote this for me when I turned 8. Charles watched as she carefully unfolded it. "Sometimes I read it when I miss her." "What does it say?" Nia looked down at the note. "It says that the people who truly care about us never disappear. Sometimes life just takes the long way around." Charles felt emotion rise in his chest again. Grace had always believed in second chances. even when circumstances gave her every reason not to. Nia folded the note and tucked it away. "Do you think she was right?" she asked. Charles looked at the little girl sitting across from him. A child who had unknowingly carried pieces of his past across 8 years. A child whose kindness seemed to reflect the woman he once loved. Outside the window, a ferry moved slowly across the river, its lights glowing against the darkness. Charles thought about the letter in his pocket, the bracelet, the photograph, the missing years, and Margaret's frightened expression. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think she was." Nia smiled. "Good." Then her expression turned thoughtful. "Because there is something else Mama wanted me to show you." Charles felt his heartbeat quicken again. "Something else?" Nia nodded and reached into the bottom of her purse. Slowly, she removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The moment Charles saw it, every trace of color vanished from his face. He recognized it instantly, because 23 years earlier, he had given an identical key to only one person in the world. Charles stared at the brass key resting in the center of Nia's palm. The faded blue ribbon attached to it looked worn from years of careful handling. His chest tightened as memories rushed back with startling clarity. 23 years earlier, he had rented a small post office box in Charleston. It was not expensive. It was not important to anyone else. But to him and Grace, it had been a promise. Whenever life became complicated, whenever distance or circumstances got in the way, they would leave letters there. It was supposed to be their constant, their place, their way back to each other. Charles slowly reached for the key. "Where did you get this?" Nia watched him carefully. "Mama gave it to me a few months before she passed away." His throat tightened. "Did she tell you what it opened?" Nia nodded. "She said it belonged to a place where forgotten things waited." Charles looked down at the key again. Forgotten things. That sounded exactly like Grace. She always found poetic ways to describe ordinary objects. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights shimmered beyond the restaurant windows while boats moved quietly across the river. Finally, Charles looked up. "Nia, do you know where this box is?" The little girl reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. She wrote down the address. Charles unfolded it immediately. The location was exactly where he remembered. A small post office in Charleston, South Carolina. His pulse quickened. "Have you ever been there?" Nia shook her head. "Mama told me not to open it by myself." "Did she say why?" "She said some stories need 2 people to understand them." Charles leaned back in his chair. Every answer seemed to create 3 more questions. Yet for the first time in decades, those questions felt close enough to touch. He looked across the table at Nia. "Would you like to know what is inside?" Nia smiled. "Very much." Charles could not help smiling back. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with Margaret's name. The smile disappeared from his face. Nia noticed immediately. "Is that your sister?" Charles looked surprised. "How did you know?" "The way you looked at the phone." The observation was so accurate that he almost laughed. Instead, he silenced the call. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "We need to talk tonight." "It cannot wait." Charles stared at the words. The uneasiness he had felt earlier returned immediately. Margaret was not asking. She was worried. Desperately worried. Nia watched him quietly. "She does not seem happy." Charles set the phone face down. "No, I do not think she is." The little girl tilted her head. "Did she know my mama?" The question lingered in the air. Charles thought carefully before answering. "Yes." Nia waited. "And?" Charles sighed softly. "And I think there are things she has not told me." Nia nodded slowly. For some reason, the answer did not seem to surprise her. "Mama used to say secrets are heavy." Charles looked at her. "She said that." "All the time." Nia took a sip of water. "She said people think secrets protect them, but mostly they just make them tired." Charles stared at the dark river beyond the glass. He suddenly wondered how tired Margaret must have been after carrying whatever truth she seemed so afraid to reveal. His phone vibrated again. This time a photograph arrived. The sender was Margaret. Charles opened it. The image showed a cardboard storage box sitting inside what appeared to be an old attic. Across the side of the box, written in faded black marker, was a name. Grace Brooks. Charles felt his pulse hammer in his chest. A second message appeared beneath the photograph. "There are things you need to see before you go to Charleston. Please come tonight." Nia leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" Charles turned the screen toward her. The little girl's eyes widened when she saw her mother's name. That was hers. Charles nodded. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Nia looked back at him. Are we going? Charles stared at the photograph one more time. The box. The key. The letters. Margaret's fear. Somehow all of it was connected. He folded the address carefully and slipped it into his pocket beside Grace's letter. Then he looked at Nia and gave a slow nod. Yes. The little girl smiled. Good. Why good? Charles asked. Nia's answer came without hesitation. Because I think Mama has been waiting a very long time for us to find the truth. An hour later, Charles's black sedan rolled through the iron gates of the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood illuminated against the night sky, its tall windows glowing softly above perfectly trimmed lawns. Nia pressed her face lightly against the glass as she looked outside. It is beautiful, she whispered. Charles followed her gaze. Normally, he barely noticed the house anymore. Tonight it felt strangely unfamiliar, as though he were arriving at someone else's life. The front doors opened before they reached the entrance. Margaret Whitmore stood waiting beneath the chandelier in the grand foyer. Her posture remained elegant, but the confidence Charles had known his entire life seemed diminished somehow. She looked tired, older, as if the years had finally caught up with her. Her eyes immediately found Nia. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed her face. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to regret. Thank you for coming, Margaret said quietly. Charles stepped forward. You said there were things I needed to see. Margaret nodded. There are. Nia remained beside Charles without speaking. The little girl seemed to sense the seriousness of the moment. Margaret's gaze softened slightly as she looked at her. You look very much like your mother. Nia blinked. You knew Mama? Margaret lowered her eyes. A long time ago. The answer felt incomplete, but nobody challenged it. Without another word, Margaret led them upstairs. The mansion was silent except for the soft echo of footsteps across polished hardwood floors. They passed family portraits, antique lamps, and framed memories stretching back generations. Finally, Margaret stopped outside a narrow wooden door at the end of a hallway. Charles frowned. The attic? Margaret nodded. I have not opened it in years. She pushed the door inward. A cool draft drifted into the hallway, carrying the scent of old paper and forgotten time. The attic was dimly lit by a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. Dust floated through the air like tiny stars. In the center of the room sat the cardboard box from the photograph. Grace Brooks. The name was still written across the side in faded marker. Nia stared at it. Charles felt his pulse quicken. Margaret remained near the doorway. She did not approach the box. Open it, she said softly. Charles walked forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. When he finally knelt beside the box, he noticed something unexpected. The lid had never been sealed. It had simply been closed and forgotten. Or hidden. He lifted it slowly. Inside were dozens of letters. Hundreds, perhaps, neatly bundled together with ribbon. Some envelopes were addressed to Grace. Others were addressed to Charles. His hands trembled as he picked one up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Grace's. The postmark showed a date from 22 years earlier. Charles stared at it in disbelief. No, he whispered. He grabbed another. Then another. Every envelope carried the same destination. Everyone had been sent. None had ever reached him. Across the room, Margaret closed her eyes. Charles slowly stood. You had these. His voice remained calm, but the hurt beneath it was impossible to miss. Margaret nodded once. Yes. For 23 years. Another nod. Nia looked from one adult to the other. She did not fully understand what was happening, but she could feel its weight. Charles stared at his sister. Why? The question echoed through the attic. Margaret looked toward the box. Because I thought I was protecting you. Charles laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Protecting me from what? Margaret swallowed hard. From losing everything you were building. Silence filled the room. She took a slow breath before continuing. Back then your investors were watching every move you made. Your future depended on perception. Your reputation mattered. I convinced myself that Grace would distract you from everything you were working toward. Charles stared at her in disbelief. So you intercepted our letters? Tears appeared in Margaret's eyes. At first, only one or two. Her voice broke. Then more. Then all of them. Nia covered her mouth with both hands. Charles felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. 23 years. 23 years of believing Grace had stopped writing. 23 years of wondering why she vanished. 23 years built on a lie. Margaret wiped her eyes. I kept telling myself I would fix it later. Charles said nothing, but later became months, then years. And eventually, I did not know how to tell you what I had done. The attic fell silent again. Nia slowly stepped closer to the box. She carefully picked up one of the envelopes and turned it over in her hands. Mama never stopped writing, she whispered. Charles looked at the letters surrounding them. An entire lifetime trapped inside a cardboard box. Then Nia noticed something sticking out beneath the bundles. A small leather journal. "What is this?" she asked. Margaret's face immediately changed. The color drained from it. Charles noticed at once. So did Nia. The little girl carefully lifted the journal from the bottom of the box. On the cover, written in silver ink, were 3 simple words. For Charles only. And suddenly everyone in the attic understood that the biggest secret had not been found yet. The attic seemed smaller now. The old lamp cast long shadows across the wooden floor while silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Nia stood beside the cardboard box holding the leather journal carefully in both hands. The silver words on the cover caught the light. For Charles only. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Margaret looked unable to breathe. Finally, Charles stepped forward and gently accepted the journal. The leather felt worn from years of handling. Grace had touched this, written in it, protected it. Somehow, despite everything that had happened, another piece of her life had survived. His fingers trembled as he opened the cover. Inside, a handwritten note rested on the first page. The date at the top was nearly 23 years old. Charles immediately recognized Grace's handwriting. He swallowed hard and began reading. "If you are holding this, then the truth finally found its way to you. I prayed it would. I just never knew how long it might take." Charles felt his chest tighten. Nia quietly moved closer. Margaret remained frozen near the doorway. "I started writing this journal because letters no longer seemed enough. There were things I wanted you to know in case life carried us farther apart than either of us expected." Charles turned the page. Every line felt like hearing Grace speak again. She wrote about ordinary days, long walks through Charleston, rainstorms she wished he could have seen, dreams she hoped would come true. The memories felt warm and alive. Then the journal changed. The entries became more personal, more emotional. Charles reached one dated several months after they had last seen each other. His heartbeat accelerated. "Charles, there is something important I need to tell you. I have tried writing this letter many times. Every version feels too small for something this important. If you are reading this, then perhaps fate finally succeeded where I failed." Charles stared at the words. Nia looked up at him. "What does it say?" He continued reading. Tears immediately filled his eyes. The room seemed to disappear. "I am going to be a mother." For several seconds, Charles simply stared at the page. He could not move. He could not think. He read the sentence again. Then again. The words never changed. "I am going to be a mother." Nia's eyes widened as she watched his expression. Margaret slowly lowered her head. Charles turned the page with shaking hands. The next lines were written more carefully, as though Grace had considered every word. "I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted to see your face when you found out. But every letter I send disappears into silence. I do not understand why. I keep hoping you will answer. I keep believing you will come." Charles felt tears slide down his face. 23 years. 23 years she had waited. 23 years she had believed he chose silence. His hands shook harder as he continued reading. "No matter what happens, I will tell our child about you. I will tell them that kindness matters. I will tell them that hope matters. And I will tell them about the man who taught me not to fear tomorrow." The attic became impossibly quiet. Charles lowered the journal slowly. His eyes moved toward Nia. The little girl stood perfectly still. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The truth was already there between them. Grace had written those words before Nia was born, before the years passed, before the separation became permanent, before all the lost time. Nia's voice was barely a whisper. "She was talking about me." Charles nodded slowly. His throat felt too tight for words. Nia blinked rapidly. "Mama wrote about me before I was even here." Another tear rolled down Charles's cheek. "Yes." Nia looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, then back at him. "Does that mean?" She stopped. The question hung unfinished in the air. Charles already knew what she was trying to ask. He looked at the journal again, then at the little girl who carried Grace's smile, Grace's kindness, and now, unmistakably, Grace's truth. Before he could answer, another folded page slipped from between the journal entries and floated gently onto the attic floor. Charles bent down and picked it up. Unlike the other pages, this one had never been opened. Across the front, written in Grace's handwriting, were 7 simple words. Open only when you know the truth. And suddenly Charles realized the journal had not revealed everything yet. The attic remained silent except for the faint hum of the old lamp overhead. Charles stared at the sealed page in his hands. Open only when you know the truth. He looked toward Nia. The little girl stood beside him with tears shining in her eyes. Yet there was a calmness in her expression that reminded him so much of Grace, it almost hurt. Margaret remained near the doorway, unable to meet either of their eyes. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Nia took a small step forward. I think we know enough now. Charles looked down at her. Do we? Nia nodded. Mama loved you. You loved her. The letters never reached you. And she never stopped waiting. Her voice remained gentle. That feels like the truth. Charles swallowed hard. After everything he had learned tonight, he knew she was right. The missing years had not been caused by indifference. They had been caused by silence, misunderstanding, and choices that could never be undone. Slowly, he broke the seal and unfolded the final page. Grace's handwriting flowed across the paper. If you are reading this, then you finally know what happened between us. That means you also know something even more important. None of it was Nia's fault. Charles felt emotion rise in his chest immediately. He continued reading. Life may have taken us down different roads, but please do not let our daughter carry the weight of our lost years. She deserves laughter. She deserves kindness. She deserves people who choose her every day. Nia covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Charles kept reading. If fate ever allows the two of you to meet, do not waste time looking backward. Spend your time building something beautiful from whatever remains. The words seemed to glow beneath the attic light. Charles read the final paragraph slowly. And Charles, if you are standing beside her right now, then there is one last thing I need you to know. The greatest gift you ever gave me was hope. The greatest gift I can leave you is Nia. Take care of each other. After the rain, there is always sunlight. The room fell completely still. Charles lowered the page. He could not speak. Across the attic, Margaret quietly began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the tears of someone who had spent too many years carrying regret. Nia looked at Charles. She knew. He nodded. Yes. She knew we would find each other. Charles looked at the letter, the journal, the bracelet, and the little girl standing beside him. Somehow Grace had believed in this moment long before either of them could imagine it. Nia suddenly stepped closer. Can I ask something? Charles smiled softly through his tears. Anything. The little girl hesitated. If Mama was telling the truth, her voice grew smaller. Does that mean you are my dad? The question hung in the air. No reporters. No cameras. No lawyers. Just a little girl asking the question she had carried in her heart. Charles felt tears fill his eyes again. He slowly knelt until they were face to face. Yes, he whispered. I believe it does. Nia stared at him for a second, as if trying to understand that one answer could change an entire life. Then she did something neither of them expected. She threw her arms around him. Charles wrapped his arms around her and held her gently. For the first time in 23 years, something broken inside him finally began to heal. Behind them, Margaret wiped away her tears. She understood there would never be a way to recover the lost years. Some mistakes could not be erased. But as she watched Charles and Nia together, she also understood something else. Grace had been right. Hope had survived. Outside the attic window, dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the estate grounds, painting the world in gold. Charles looked toward the growing light, and then back at Nia. She smiled. After the rain? Charles laughed softly. After the rain. And for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt like something he had lost. It felt like something he had finally found.